Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. This is now our 8th and final lecture in this series from content in Chapter 1 of the textbook. You remember that we started asking the question, what is business? We've talked a little bit about economic systems, supply and demand, the market economy, how the market economy works in the big picture, and therefore how do we measure an entire nation's economic performance. And therefore one of our great concerns is how healthy is our national economy? How stable is it? Is it growing and is it healthy? Is it growing at a proper and healthy growth rate? All those kinds of things. In other words, as we see in this title slide, what gives us economic stability? Economic stability is something that nations strive to maintain and to foster because economic stability leads to all sorts of good outcomes, including predictable, healthy growth, increased productivity, greater efficiency, higher standards of living, all of those kinds of things. And so let's take a look at what helps us to become more economically stable. Well, first let's define some terms. Economic stability can very much be equated with a state in which the amount of money available in an economic system and the quantity of goods and services produced by that system are growing at roughly the same rate. These are very, very desirable things where the amount of money in the money supply, the national money supply, and the quantity of goods and services together in the aggregate are growing in the positive sense, and are growing at about the same rate. This is a situation where our standard of living is improving, where we are able as consumers to enjoy better and more goods and services. We're all better off, and the entire economic system is growing and performing at a greater rate of productivity and efficiency. These are very, very good and desirable things for any national economy. And yet there are challenges. There are things that can make conditions that can happen in an economic system which threaten stability. The first of which is inflation, when widespread price increases occur throughout an economic system. Well, it's one thing to buy, for instance, a gallon of gas for your car at $2.80 a gallon. But what happens when the price increases suddenly from $2.80 to $3.10? And then you go to get gas the next time you need to fill up, it's no longer $3.10, it's now $4 a gallon. Where 2 weeks ago it was $2.80. When rapid inflation happens in an economic system, when prices increase at a rate that the amount of money you're being paid doesn't increase, it means your dollar buys less and it threatens the stability of the economy. What happens when there is, second bullet point, growing levels of unemployment, when the level of joblessness among people actively seeking work in an economic system increases quickly or drastically or suddenly? What happens when the unemployment rate goes from 2% to 18% within the span of a couple of months? Those are difficult times. There are people who would like to find work, but there are no jobs for them with their current level of training and experience and education, and therefore you have people outside of the employment and therefore the consumer cycle. They're not able to enjoy a standard of living commensurate with having a regular paycheck. That also will threaten economic stability over time. And when these kinds of things happen, eventually what can happen is a period during which aggregate output declines. This is known as a recession. So if you've ever heard the term on the news that this particular country or the US is going through an economic recession, it means a period during which GDP or aggregate output is declining from the previous period. This is not a good thing. It challenges our economic stability. It's negative growth. And therefore, when you hear the term depression, depression refers to a prolonged and deep recession, not merely for a season, not merely for a business cycle or a year, but for several years. And that is a very, very difficult situation which really does break and damage economic stability. And it takes sometimes some very, very significant government measures in order to break the depression, to break and heal the depression, to get the nation back to a level of growing productivity. As a result, government many times will step in with either small or large policy measures in order to manage and control the growth of the U.S. economy. There are fiscal policies, and those are policies used by the government regarding how it collects and spends revenue. Now, think about this for just a moment. What is the typical way our federal government collects revenue? Well, through the Internal Revenue Service. That's right, through income and property taxes and the other form of taxes that are out there, right? Taxes represent revenue to the government, and therefore, how and to what level it creates policies to increase or decrease the level of revenue it collects through taxes is one measure of managing the U.S. economy. Of course, that's just the income side. On the expense side, there are fiscal policies for how a government spends revenue. We won't talk about those that much here because this is not a political science class, but just understand, anytime someone either complains or lauds how government is spending money, it is part of fiscal policy. Policies designed to manage the overall U.S. economy. There are also monetary policies used by a government to control the size, the amount of the money supply, the overall money supply in a particular nation. This is not a money and banking class. However, if you go on to become a finance major and take several money and banking classes, you will learn money theory and exactly what happens when a government reduces the amount of money in the system, when it purchases that money back, or when it injects new money into the economic system, what that does for the U.S. economy. Nevertheless, realize that is one side of the equation of how you are trying to manage the overall flow of money in an economy, is you control the amount of money in the system to begin with. Finally, there are stabilization policies. Government economic policy intended to smooth out fluctuations in output, unemployment, and to stabilize prices. And those can be either small or very, very, very significant historically. We've had examples of very, very significant federal government policy intended to get the economy moving again. The most prominent example would probably be Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal policies to lift the U.S. out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. You may have studied that in your high school government class or something similar to that. Nevertheless, realize that those kinds of policies, all of those are used in the aggregate to manage and keep the U.S. economy stable and growing. And stability is typically defined as the amount of money in the system and the spending and growth of the system working hand in hand and growing at the same appropriate rate. Now, what does this mean? It means that any nation's economy is a difficult beast to manage. It can be stubborn, it can get out of control. It's almost like sometimes college kids at a party. And therefore, it takes a great deal of wisdom and sometimes patience, sometimes restraint, sometimes decisive action to manage a national economy. The goal, of course, is always stable, healthy growth. But there are many, many factors that can cause departures from stable, healthy growth, and therefore, many times, government needs to step in and try to do something to correct course to get healthy growth back on track again. These are all the kinds of things that can affect not only an economic system, but specific industries and even individual businesses. And therefore, it becomes part of our introductory chapter, chapter 1, in this topic about an introduction to business, Business 101. Thanks so much for your attention in this lecture and in this entire first chapter of content. We'll see you in the next set of lectures.